Hi, I'm Jason Gore for ThatShelf.com, and we're here to look at the Vancouver International Film Festival screening of Blue Moon.
Thanks, James.
So, Blue Moon is the first of two big works from in 2025 from Richard Linklater. Blue Moon played at the Berlinale in the spring, and in May in Cannes, Nouvelle Vague played. Now, I'm on record here on this channel talking about how much I love Nouvelle Vague. I think it's extraordinary. Absolutely amazing, ambitious, glorious film. Blue Moon worked a little bit less for me. I love the idea of it, but for me, it felt a little stagey and a little claustrophobic in its telling. Nonetheless, the fact these two films are very interesting how they play out, and he's a remarkable filmmaker. One I think we, in a funny way, we take for granted. Sure, something like Boyhood, I think, was in a weird way overpraised because I think people were so appreciative of the ambition of it all, of taking all these years to actually shoot this film. Some of the Before trilogy is obviously beloved by many people, and then the goofy things that he did sort of earlier in his career, all right, etc. There's much to love, but I think he's sort of found his voice in multiple iterations. That you can't just say this feels exactly like a Richard Linklater film, and I think it's really strong. I love that these two films feel very different. If you didn't know they were the same director, you wouldn't necessarily spot it immediately, and yet clearly these are both films about creativity, about the dynamics, interpersonal dynamics, about creative people, the challenges of getting your art to the masses. All of this speaks obviously very deeply to somebody, a true independent like Linklater, who since Slacker has been sort of paving a very specific way. Somebody who I think in is growing increasingly sort of embraced as a great filmmaker. It is wild to me that he's still, in some ways, I think, considered sort of brushed with a slightly Slickerian brush, if that makes any sense. It is funny to think of somebody being underappreciated who's obviously got as many plaudits as he does. But for somebody, I compared him to someone like Soderbergh, who I think is held up on a pedestal. Whether or not it's deserving or not, he's held up on a pedestal as somebody like Linklater is sort of dismissed more easily. And honestly, I think that in many ways, Linklater is probably the stronger filmmaker. Bold, I know. That being said, Blue Moon, I think, for me, works a little bit less well, even though it is absolutely something that speaks to my heart, pun intended. This is the story of Lorenz Hart and his dynamic with Richard Rodgers, who went off to do Oklahoma with Oscar Hammerstein. Hammerstein, I guess it is how he went to. Ethan Hawke, Margaret Qualley, Bobby Carnival, and Andrew Scott are the main sort of participants here. And it's really Ethan Hawke as the absolute center of this. Unsurprisingly, Ethan Hawke has this very vast experience of working with, obviously, the Before films, etc. And he plays the sort of goofy, short, obnoxious, precocious dynamic of him basically having conversations with his bartender, played by Bobby, a sort of love interest, or at least an infatuation, in Margaret Qualley. And their dynamic, I don't always buy it all the time, especially he's trying to sort of come across as this short little guy, so you feel him sort of walking on his knees. It just feels a little like they're trying too much, like it's a little bit pantomime, including, I gotta say, Ethan Hawke, who I think is great, but his sort of Yiddishisms, his sort of very New York, very Jewy kind of things don't work. So it feels almost pastiche, and I didn't love that as much as it was probably presented as. It feels a very Goyish version of Yiddish, if that makes any sense. That's not necessarily something that the film can't recover from. I just think that the way that it's even filmed, it very much feels like you're watching a play. You're in one location, but there's nothing sort of cinematically engaging. It doesn't mean that the camera has to do something totally ridiculous, but there's a feeling of sort of it's not intentional claustrophobia. It just feels limiting. It feels that these stories are all monologues, that even when you're having conversations between two people, that there's an audience that they're performing to, it's not that there's a lack of naturalism, it's that it feels performative. And because of that, I think that the film sort of suffers. That being said, it's still thoroughly enjoyable to see sort of these terrific performers just sort of get into the engagement, dynamics. Even when they're having conversations in the hallways, you kind of get tense. It's like they wouldn't just be lingering there. It's just an artificiality to it all, of its staging, of its direction, frankly, that doesn't necessarily work for me. And yet the performances elicited, given all of these elements, I think are quite strong. So for me, it's certainly a mixed bag. I love this dynamic of going off and having your former collaborator go on. It's a bit repetitive in how it deals with that. I don't love the fact that the film actually begins with the ending, if that makes any sense, just to get people in the mood. I actually kind of like the idea that if you actually excise that part and make it even more weirdly insular and claustrophobic in an intentional way, I think that actually would have provided more anxiety. I kind of would have liked that even more, of the sense that you're kind of hovering around him, whereas this really feels like we're playing, that we have a proscenium that we're watching everything play out in, and that's sort of our stage on which we set, but we're not meant to feel as claustrophobic as we end up being, if that makes any sense. It's a hard dynamic. It's a hard thing to pull off. I'm not sure that this film did. When it works, but these other elements, I think, for me, sort of made the film not necessarily quite the home run that I kind of wanted it to be. It may be minor in the grand Linklaterian canon, but it's still quite extraordinary that in this calendar year, he's released these two disparate and yet connected and yet very different films. One, I think, is one of the grand films of the year, just an exceptional investigation of artistry and all that stuff, and the challenges of working with schmucks and all of that stuff. And the other one, which is also about the challenges of working with schmucks. One, in Nouvelle Vague, I think, is this beautiful love letter that has a sweep and an epicness, but also an intimacy, and the other one that is restricted by its nature of its telling and doesn't quite burst out of its bubble that it creates. Still, what's not to love about Blue Moon as a composition, and what's not to love about Lorenz Hart and the remarkable legacy that him and his lyrics actually represent. For thatshelf.com, I'm Jason Gorber. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on social media. We'll see you next video. All the best. Take care.